In het oude Athene, of misschien al eerder, deden mensen een grote ontdekking. Ze konden samen als gelijke beslissingen nemen. Sindsdien is de democratie bijgeschaafd, verfijnd en aangepast. Maar ook verdwenen, onderdrukt en misvormd. Tegenlicht onderzoekt 3 weken lang de stand van de democratie. Deze week, hoe houdbaar is de democratie?
I think that we are living, as Dickens would say, in the best of times and the worst of times. There are many innovative things happening in the field of democracy. If you visit South Africa, if you visit India. But there are also terrible things going on. These are the worst of times. There are growing numbers of unsolved problems that threaten democracy, its spirit. It's as if there are emerging bundles of problems for which democrats and democratic institutions have no solutions.
I think we face a real crisis in the Western world. What you see is the fundamental inability in every Western society to do one thing, which is to impose any kind of short-term pain for long-term gain. Whenever a government tries to propose some kind of pain, there is a revolt. And the revolt is almost always successful.
Leaders should be ahead of time, should have a vision, not just look at the public opinion poll. Politicians, because they want to get a vote, sometimes they sacrifice a country's long-term interests only for short-term gain.
I think it's in a pretty bad state. If you think about this crisis, instead of seeing democracy take back control over money, which ought to be a common resource, the powers that control money for their own purposes have effectively taken over government.
I would say that probably among many people that you would talk to, I'm much more optimistic about our democracies than not. Our democracies show tremendous warts. They show their dirty laundry. Their faults are daily reminders for us. And for me, that's very much their strength.
Over 4 weken beleven we weer het feest van de democratie. Maar hoe leuk is dat feestje eigenlijk nog? Zijn we nog wel in staat om nieuw leven in ons politieke systeem te blazen? Of zijn we getuigen van de laatste stuiptrekkingen op weg naar een nieuw tijdperk na de democratie? In dat laatste geval is de grote vraag hoe die nieuwe tijd eruit zou kunnen zien. En welke invloed de opnieuw ontwakende reus van het oosten op dit proces heeft. Komt hij onze kant op? Of wijst hij ons de weg in dat landschap na de democratie? Deze vragen legden we voor aan 5 vooraanstaande denkers over het wel en wee van de democratie. John Keane, Brit en Australiër, professor of politics aan het Center for the Study of Democracy in Londen en schrijver van The Life and Death of Democracy. Hilary Wainwright, Britse, feministe, socialiste en verbonden aan het Transnational Institute. Schrijfster van Reclaim the State, Experiments in Popular Democracy. Fareed Zakaria, Amerikaan van Indiase komaf, schrijvend voor Newsweek, presentator bij CNN en schrijver van onder meer The Post-American World. William Dobson, Amerikaan, voorheen werkzaam bij Foreign Policy en de Carnegie Endowment en werkend aan het boek The Dictator's Learning Curve. En Cheng Li, Amerikaan van Chinese afkomst, fellow aan het Brookings Institution in Washington en samensteller van China's Changing Political Landscape, Prospects for Democracy. We beginnen met de historicus en een fijne essentiële binnenkomer. Is democratie een historische noodzakelijkheid?
The history of democracy is full of examples of thinkers, of figures that have supposed that democracy has some kind of historical inevitability. Beginning, for example, in the Athenian assembly, where you will see from the speeches and from the plays and the poems a deep-seated belief among its male citizens that Athenian democracy was inevitable, that the gods had blessed democratie, that this explained why Athens had come to be the imperial power in the Greek world, and why its future was assured. Sun Yat-sen, in famous lectures in the 1920s in China, preached the view to many thousands of people who gathered to hear these public lectures that democracy has several historical phases. Democracy, he claimed, was originally a Chinese invention. It had then moved to the West, and it was being reinvented in the East, and the future was bright for Eastern democracy, which would be the culmination of a certain historical inevitability. And final example, in our times, it was Francis Fukuyama, who famously, in the spring of 1989, wrote the essay at the right time, which effectively proposed that there was no intellectual alternative to so-called American-style liberal democracy. It turns out that these views are not only controversial, they're deeply mistaken in my view, because even a cursory glance at the history of democracy shows its fragility. It is easily killed off by war, by the breakdown of class agreements. It is destroyed by pauperization, elite panic. The panic of elites can destroy, as happened in Weimar, for example, can destroy democracy. It is a very tender plant.
De democratie is geen klaproos die vanzelf overal opduikt, maar een teer plantje dat gekoesterd en verzorgd moet worden. We vermoeden al zoiets. Maar wat gaat er precies mis met democratia? Want het gaat nu even niet zo goed met het plantje. Dat is althans de bevinding van Freedom House, een onafhankelijke NGO die al 40 jaar de stand van de democratie bijhoudt.
For the first time in the 40 years that they've been issuing this report, there's been a 4-year consecutive decline in political and economic freedom around the world. They would say that right now there is a freedom recession going on around the world. We have the fewest electoral democracies that we have had since 1995. And the overall number of people who are countries that are free has stagnated at 46%, and that's been the case since 1998.
I think that the older system of democracy that we had in the West, and I mean only 30 or 40 years ago, was a more Aristotelian system. Aristotle talked about a mixed regime, by which he meant every government has elements of democracy, elements of aristocracy, and these are blended together. And the aristocratic element of government was a certain kind of long-term vision for society. And that long-term vision was expressed despite what people might think at this moment. And so there was a tendency to outweigh public opinion for the moment with these longer-term concerns. And I'd say certainly that is the way in which an Adenauer functioned in Germany, a de Gaulle functioned in France. That is the way in which an Eisenhower functioned in the United States. That there was, yes, there were populist clamors of the moment, but there was also a longer-term sense of what the country needed.
The trends are clear in practically every democracy. parties which are supposed to be the conduit, the lifeline, the link between citizens and government decision-making, parties are breaking down. There is now a strong possibility, looking into the future, that parties will not perform any significant functions. Imagine a democracy in which political parties play a marginal role. It's easy to imagine, because that is indeed what is going on.
A class of people who seem to be constantly circulating around the sort of top jobs, you know, so that in Britain, I mean, I think it's the same in most European countries, but, you know, when a minister leaves office or when there's an election and they lose, they don't go back to being like an ordinary person. They become the head of a bank or director of a big company. And so, and this is happening just all the time, so that it looks like politicians, I mean, the principle of a representative democracy originally was the idea that people would be elected and then, you know, challenged and sometimes diselected. And then they would go back to being ordinary people.
The purpose of the elected representative is to listen to citizens, to take their advice, to lead openly, honestly, and to accept that after a term in office, the representative has to come back to face the music, to listen to the verdict, and either to be returned or thrown out onto the streets. In England, this is called getting rid of the bastards. Politicians
have, in a way, sold their soul, if you like, to the markets. I mean, I'm thinking, going back to Mrs. Thatcher, that in a sense unleashed the financial markets, deregulated them. And I think, you know, she has this phrase, get the government off the back of the people. But actually, what she did was to get the people off the back of government and allow the markets to control government. So I think the institutional flaws are to do with the breaking of the connections between the people and government, so that in a way government is now just miles away from the people, and so easily grabbed by private interests.
Parties' policies are typically dictated from above by their leaders. In many cases, they are on the margins of criminality because how they are funded is not easily resolved, and it typically involves, not only in Britain, not only in the United States, but in many other democracies, it involves going to the very rich and powerful for money that is then laundered through the party in order to carry out election campaigns. There is a strong feeling among electorates that parties fudge issues, that they say one thing, they do another, or that when there is a large parties vying for the center ground, they become indistinguishable. The interesting question is, for large numbers of people, why political parties? What do they actually do for us, except try to manipulate our votes, except to try to get us out to vote in a system where there is not compulsory voting? And there is a serious identity crisis, I think, which is breaking out. And that's very serious for the future of democracy, because one of the linchpins, one of the central nervous systems of democracy in our times is open, clean, fair elections in which different viewpoints battle it out. That's why parties are functionally necessary.
Of course, the role of money in politics is corrupting in some ways. But the bigger problem is the way in which special interests can organize themselves against all possible efforts to in some way take benefits away from them. Because that means the whole system gets paralyzed. And these special interests are sometimes big business, but sometimes they are retirees. Sometimes they are unions. The problem is that all of them have the power, so nothing ever gets done. Because on any change in policy, someone is going to be negatively affected. And those people can organize themselves, and they care much more about this issue than society at large. So they will hammer the system and batter it in because the system is increasingly open. This is what I mean when I say there's a democratic flaw in the system. The system is so open that it overweighs the negative efforts of these special interests and underweighs the importance of society in general.
Twee analyses die eigenlijk neerkomen op een hele simpele constatering. We hebben te veel democratie of we hebben er juist te weinig van. Laten we met die vraag in ons achterhoofd eens uitzoomen. Hoe gaat het met het project dat eind vorige eeuw zo voortvarend van start leek te gaan? De verspreiding van de democratie over de rest van de wereld.
So far, you would have to say that there is a trend towards ever more democracy. And certainly in the Western world, there has been a trend towards ever more democracy. The simple numbers are clear. In 1900, democracy was something that was practiced in a small handful of countries that were nestled around the North Atlantic. You know, Western Europe, really Northwestern Europe and the United States and Canada. Today, you have, I don't remember the exact number, but it's about 100 countries that have democratic systems that would be considered reasonably legitimate. Will it go on forever? That is, I think, the crucial question.
Right now is a particularly, I would say, in the grand scheme of things, now is not a particularly strong moment for democracy. There are a lot of reasons for that. It's democracies that have been particularly hurt by a global economic recession. Unemployment in countries is at very high levels. Discontent is high. The politics in individual countries, particularly in the United States, which I know best, is very polarizing. It's very bitter. It's also true that some of the problems have been generated by democracies themselves, and particularly when we think globally. So it's very hard for people who are not living in a democracy to look up to the mantle of democracy and what it stands for when they see images like Abu Ghraib, when they're reminded of the continued presence of Guantanamo, when the headlines for many years were focused on the war in Iraq. These were not wonderful signposts for the virtues of democracy.
While we have seen an expansion of democracy, at every sense, the opening up of the system, greater transparency, greater openness, I'm not sure it has always come with better government, better politics. In fact, over the last 20 or 30 years, I think you could make the case that you have seen a worse political system develop in many Western countries and in Western-style democracies. I'm thinking of Israel, which has increasingly opened up its political system and produced greater and greater polarization, dysfunction, paralysis.
Why has there been a decline in the number of democracies or political or economic freedoms in the world today has more to do with the authoritarian governments than it does with the democracies. There are a number of sort of critical things. One in particular is the events of recent time. In particular, the color revolutions is sort of noted as being a bright line where a number of regimes around the world woke up to the possible danger that they too could have a color revolution in their midst. And so you see from that moment in time, these regimes becoming much more active and aggressive in making sure that they don't go the way of Ukraine, Serbia, or Georgia. One of the great threats that these regimes have faced, and that they noted in the color revolutions, was a robust civil society, the growth of NGOs who were able to really clamor for and put pressure on the regime to bring freedoms in other areas of life. Well, not only have they curtailed the ability of these organizations to operate. But they've also gone one step further, which is to create their own NGOs. State government-operated NGOs, which are sometimes referred to as gongos. And the gongo has several purposes. One, it crowds out the legitimate NGOs that do exist. So it becomes much more difficult for the public to understand who to believe, because when the gongo, which will have a name like, you know, Support for Human Rights in Egypt, which sounds quite, well, wonderful and innocuous, will issue reports that will suggest that, well, there are human rights problems in Egypt, but they're not systematic. Or the situation, we have problems and there are things that we need to work on, but we're getting better. So they seem credible to the public, but at the same time, they paint a much rosier picture than what is actually the case. Beyond that, these organizations soak up funding. It is the case that the United States and EU entities have been funding what are gongos. So it also that drains the possible resources that are there for those who are legitimate human rights defenders or NGOs. That's an innovation.
There are experiments going on in the age of the internet. China is, I think, at the cutting edge, where governments cleverly are developing tools for using the internet to control the internet for undemocratic ends. For example, through the recruitment of what are called internet debaters, 50-cent bloggers. If on the internet a firestorm develops of protest against the authorities, the Communist Party authorities, then one way of dealing with this is to recruit 1 million or 2 bloggers who respond and who swamp the protest with their own pro-government views. It's a very 21st century cutting-edge development.
We do not have evidence, but certainly you do see that government is in proactive mood. They wanted to use all possible ways to undermine this kind of real threat to them. They understand they're fighting an uphill battle, and pure censorship cannot work. They should change their image. But on the other hand, some blogs become increasingly critical of Chinese leaders, and they are not censored. And of course, government now have some trouble to deal with that issue. One person his name is Han, from Shanghai, 28 years old, high school dropout, and his blog has 330 million hits over the past few years. And most of his essays in that blog is quite critical of the Chinese government. Yes, Chinese government could censor Google, could arrest Liu Xiaobo, Charter 08, but they cannot arrest Han. He is so popular particularly among college students, and particularly female students.
What would happen if they would arrest him?
There would be a revolution, because the regime lost moral high ground, period. Completely. There are some of the things they could not do.
Is the internet key?
Absolutely, it is. It's the case that in Egypt today, for example, bloggers are more likely to be persecuted than print journalists. What would Tiananmen Square have looked like if people had had mobile phones? If people had had video, the ability to take video off of their phone? The internet is a crucial way for allowing individual actors to be able to share information globally in an instant. This is not something, this is a pressure that these regimes did not have to deal with before. And so they are working very hard to come up with ways to try and stay ahead of it. It's very much a foot race of technology. And it's very important to realize that the regimes are quite